Thank you, Bud Heckman. It's really wonderful to be here. I've wanted to come here for many years, since I follow events in America, even though I live in Israel, and I heard about the Tri-Faith Initiative, and I thought maybe someday I'll come here, and then all of a sudden Bud Heckman shows up in Omaha, and he says, do you want to come out here and promote your book, which I wrote last year? And I said, sure. So I'm really happy to be here in this beautiful synagogue, and this amazing center, which I hope will grow and flourish in the years ahead and spread its model all over America and the world. Amen, right? Okay. So I want to talk to you a bit about the work that I've done in Israel for the last 28 years. I've lived in Israel for 40 years. As you can tell, I didn't grow up in Israel. I grew up in Miami, Florida, born in New York, but I moved to Israel when I was young and naive and idealistic. I am now post-young, post-naive, but I think I'm still idealistic, otherwise I wouldn't be there. The talk I'm going to share with you, I call it the Other Peace Process. InterReligious Dialogue is a form of peace building. And this is based on the work that I did in the field for almost 3 decades. In 1991, I and a group of mostly Christians, there may have been some Muslims at the beginning, but not many, formed an organization which we call the InterReligious Coordinating Council in Israel, ICCI, which lasted until 3 years ago. It is now part of history, so you can read about it on the internet or in the history books. And the idea of the InterReligious Coordinating Council is very similar to the idea of the Tri-Faith Initiative. It was to bring people of the different faith communities together in Israel to see if they could learn more about each other, encounter the other, and therefore promote peaceful relations between the people of the different religious and national communities in our land. So I want to divide my talk into 3 parts. One will be about the context. Let's see if I can hit the right button here. Did that do it? No, I'm not doing it. I'll try this one. That's better? No, also no. I'm not so good at technology. What am I hitting wrong, Bud? Give me a hand here. I just want to move it. Sorry. Yeah, do I have to hit this each time?
You can also do the arrow.
The arrow, okay. All right. So I want to talk about the context. I will argue that in every place where one does interreligious dialogue, the context of where you do it matters. In a place like Omaha or cities across North America, it's really related to community relations, how people of different faith communities can learn to live together in the same city or the same region. In our neighborhood, it's about living in a conflict zone, a war zone, and therefore it's a very different kind of thing. So I'll talk a bit about the context. Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what I call the 4-step model, how we did interreligious dialogue for 25 years with Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and what we learned from it. And perhaps this model can be of some use to you here. And if we get to the 3rd point, I'm going to say a few words about looking towards the future, how the political stuff and how the interreligious dialogue come together or should come together in building peaceful relations down the road. Okay. This is going to be Kronish's quick history of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process of the last 25 years. If I was in an academic setting, I would spend an hour and a half doing this, but since I'm not there, I'm going to do it kind of quickly. So when I used to do this years ago, before one of my children showed me how to make a PowerPoint, I used to draw it on the board, and it looked more like a mountain. So you're supposed to think it's a mountain. And we're going uphill. You see the arrow, we're going uphill, because creating peace is an uphill struggle in our area and in other conflict areas in the world. So, once upon a time in the ancient 1990s, before Facebook, iPhones, Twitter, and all these things, we had a peace process in Israel and Palestine. 1991 was a conference in Madrid called by the Bush administration. It was the beginning of peace talks, the first time that Israelis and Palestinians engaged in any formal negotiations. Prior to the 90s, you may know, our conflict used to be known as the Israel-Arab conflict. We used to fight wars with Arab countries. We don't do that too much anymore, thank God. We have a peace agreement with Egypt. We have one with Jordan. We'll talk about that in a minute. So in the 90s, the conflict changed, and it became known as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And for the first time, Palestinians began entering into negotiations with the leaders of the State of Israel. The real breakthrough came in 1993. In September 1993, we citizens of Israel, you citizens of America and the world, woke up one morning and we were told that there had been 10 months of secret negotiations in Norway, in and around Oslo, therefore the Oslo Accords, between delegates of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and representatives of the government of Israel, and including academics. In fact, the whole thing was a ruse under the guise of academic conferences. And for 10 months, Palestinian leaders, academic and government, and Israeli leaders, academic and government, met and sat and talked, and they did a lot of what I call schmoozing. Have you heard of schmoozing in Omaha? Okay, that's what I call dialogue. Besides the official meetings, a lot of meals together, a lot of sitting around the campfire, a lot of informal trust building went on. And after 10 months, they reached an historic agreement, the first ever agreement between the Palestinian people and the Jewish people, or the Israeli government. And it became known as the Oslo Accords, although, as you may recall, it was signed on September 13, 1993, on the White House lawn under the tutelage of President Bill Clinton. The famous photo is Bill Clinton in the middle. On one side is Yasser Arafat. On the other side is Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Foreign Minister at that time, Shimon Peres, later become President of Israel. So the Oslo Accords, whether one likes them or don't like them, or doesn't like them, or critical or not, changed the entire landscape in the relations between Israelis and the Palestinian people. And there were four main principles for us to remember about these accords, which in theory underline the so-called peace process to this very day. Okay. The first and most important principle of what they called the Declaration of Principles was the concept of mutual recognition. It's a basic principle in interfaith dialogue anywhere. In this case, it meant, for the first time in our history, the Jewish people, the State of Israel, recognizes the existence of the Palestinian people, and in exchange, the Palestinian people recognize the existence of the State of Israel. It was never perfectly symmetrical, and it still isn't to this day. But this mutual recognition was a fundamental change in how we saw each other, formally, diplomatically, officially. Second principle of the Oslo Accords had to do with the notion of how our leaders at that time thought that the conflict should be resolved. Until then, the conflict was mostly resolved by various wars. The principle enunciated in Oslo was, we will now resolve our conflict through negotiations and dialogue rather than war. And I don't know if anybody in this room remembers, but Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, on the White House launch September 13th, 1993, delivered a beautiful talk. I think it was probably written by a rabbi. It sounded very rabbinic. And it was all about how he had enough of war, and for the sake of his children and grandchildren, we should reach more peace agreements through negotiation. Yes, he really said it. You can check it out on YouTube if you don't believe me. So we now would resolve by talking rather than by shooting, was the idea. The third idea is, in order to reach agreements, we need to use a big C word, which is compromise. We had the notion of territorial compromise around for a long time, but here the idea was each side has to get off its ideological tree, high tree, and come down and reach what some people called over the years painful compromises for peace. Each side has to give in a lot in order to reach a compromise that's going to work for everybody, so nobody's going to be totally happy. And the fourth point of Oslo I discovered when I was writing my book 2 years ago, and I went back and read some of the agreements. They call it their historical reconciliation. That's a big one. That means when we really get in the act of making peace together, like in South Africa and other places, it's going to involve reconciliation, which means a little bit of apologizing each side what they did to each other, historic reconciliation, not for history, but for the future. So that was Oslo, and it was a big sea change. 3 months later, the end of December 1993, the Vatican decides to recognize the State of Israel, and there were negotiations with the State of Israel, and on December 31st, 1993, the Vatican signs with Israel in the Foreign Ministry, and I was there to see it and witness it. The fundamental agreement between the Holy See and the State of Israel, in which the Vatican recognizes the existence of the State of Israel, which they had never quite done in a formal way until then. And according to the Vatican ambassador, who I knew well in Jerusalem at the time, it could have only happened during this opening, after the opening of the Oslo Accords. And of course, it's a mutual agreement where the little tiny Jewish state of just a few million Jews recognizes the Catholic Church, which is a little larger and has more followers. The next year, 1994, we have another agreement with Jordan. It's still Clinton, Arafat, Rabin. And so if you were living in Israel at that time, like I was, we had the old peace agreement with Egypt. So the Egyptian border, no more wars. We now had a historic agreement with the Palestinian people, which, when it happened, people on both sides were practically dancing in the streets with euphoria that peace was at hand. I only say that now because people don't remember that back then. And then we make peace with Jordan, which is, if you've been to Israel, I assume many of you have, it's a pretty long border, right? It goes all the way from Aqaba, Eilat, and all the way up to the Syrian border. So we neutralize the violence there. So Yemei HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah were practically at hand, you understand? There was a feeling back in 92, 93, 94, until 95, that something was really happening here, that peace negotiations were moving, there was political progress. And despite all the terror and counter-terror and rejectionists trying to stop it, it kept going forward. A few years later, 1998, Clinton's still president. Around that time, we elected a young man named Netanyahu. And in his first term, he is summoned by President Clinton to what was called White River Plantation, if any of you remember this. 1998, and Arafat was there, and we have pictures to prove it. He shook hands with Arafat. If you don't remember, Netanyahu was one of the main opposers of the Oslo Accords prior to that. He shook hands with, thank you, I meant to bring that with me, thank you. He shook hands with Arafat, and he actually took out a pen, not this pen, a pen, and he signed an agreement with the Palestinian people. I like to remind people that maybe he could do it again. Maybe he'll remember that. So we had another agreement. Footnote, the last agreement we had between the State of Israel and the Palestinian people, moderated by the United States, was in 1998. So it's 20 years now since we had an agreement. And then we're climbing the mountain. We're almost at the top. In the summer 2000, Netanyahu is unelected. We elect a new man named Ehud Barak, who came out of the military like Rabin did. And like Rabin, he wouldn't sell the Israeli people down the river on security. So he's brought to Camp David II by Clinton, and he and all his advisors went there with the intention of signing the final peace agreement, and the papers, the newspapers in Israel said, end of conflict in sight. Which meant that the decade of the 90s was meant to end with resolving the conflict. And those who were negotiating at that time thought that they had all the answers in their briefcases, think tanks, policy papers on every issue you could name, Jerusalem, refugees, right of return. It was all worked out. And there are plenty of papers around which had, as it were, the solutions. So they go to Camp David II in the Maryland mountains. And they worked very hard for several days. Then they were about to go home, and Clinton said, give me a couple more days. We're so close. Some of you may remember the picture of him shoving Arafat and Barak back into the room. And they tried a few more days. And does anybody remember what happened? It didn't work out. It failed. And everybody went home unhappy. From that time, we have the beginning of what I call the blame game. Whose fault is it that it failed? The other side's fault. And you can go to Ramallah, which is the unofficial capital of Palestine these days, or you can go to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, and you can hear the same line. Just one's in Arabic and one's in Hebrew. And the line is, we don't have a partner for peace. The other guy is not living up to the commitments that we signed back in 93 and 98. And it's the other person's fault. And so each side has simply been blaming each other all this time. So, I'm going to make this part a little shorter. I used to call this part, the peace process, part 2, but a couple years ago I redid this, and I now call it what it is, which is the war process. So basically, in the last now nearly 2 decades, we've had a series of wars with Gaza, a war in Lebanon, a second intifada, violence, counter-violence, and we are now, this is a little old, in the end of 2018, and we're going downhill. We haven't hit bottom yet. When we hit bottom, that's third intifada, war with Iran. I don't know what is bottom, but we're not at bottom yet. But we're going downhill, okay? And most of the people who've grown up in the last 18 years only know this reality of war and violence and walls and counter walls and so forth and so on, which has led to a situation in our area, in our region, which I call political despair. I know some of you may be feeling that in this room, but we're not discussing that now, about other places in the world. Okay. Political despair in our world, in our region, means that if you speak to Palestinians, as I do all the time, or you speak to Israeli Jews, neither side believes that their current leaders have a plan to end the conflict. Neither side sees a pragmatic approach to peace anymore, as was the case 20 years ago. So that has led a lot of people to despair of the possibilities of peace. And political despair is a problem. No question it's a problem. A few years ago, I was talking about this in a Anglican church in New York called St. Bart's, 51st and Park. I was invited there to do what they call a rector's forum. I was interviewed by the rector after Sunday morning services. I came a bit early, and I said hello to the rector, and he was saying his version of Shabbat Shalom to his congregants, peace be unto you. And the person he was talking to was a fellow named George Mitchell. Anybody who doesn't know, George Mitchell was a senator from Maine for many years. He was, for 6 years, the majority leader of the Senate, and an influential senator, and he happened to live and belong to that church. And I was very honored that he came to the forum. And during the question period, or maybe even in the middle, he raised his hand to ask what I call a Jewish question. That's a question that's usually a comment that may or may not have a question mark. But the rector, since it's George Mitchell, said, that's fine, that's okay. And when he heard me talking about political despair, he said, I have the following story to share with you. So you may know that Senator Mitchell, in addition to other things he did, is famous for having resolved the Northern Ireland conflict. And he was appointed by Clinton and spent 5 years on that conflict. I'm actually reading a book of his right now on that, that he wrote called Making Peace. I read his biography a few weeks ago, and so it led me to read the next book. And he stood up and he said, I have to tell you the following story. In the last week, it's called the Good Friday Agreement. It happened in April 10th, 1998. In the last week, I flew over to Belfast, and I arrived on a Monday morning, and I opened the newspapers, and the newspaper said, the latest poll says that 84% of Catholics in Northern Ireland and 84% of Protestants say there will never be an agreement here. It's quite impossible that these two sides have been fighting each other for decades and centuries will reach an agreement. And 5 days later, we had an agreement. So I like to repeat George Mitchell's story because I am a George Mitchell chassid, how would I say that, follower. Now, I don't accept the notion that there will never be an agreement. Anybody who lived in Israel in the 70s, and you had told anybody, the president of Egypt might show up in the Knesset one day, who's going to believe that? Nobody. Anybody who lived in Israel in the early 90s, if you told them the prime minister of Israel is going to shake hands on the White House lawn with Yasser Arafat, nobody. So we would get the same results in the poll today in Israel, and I think we still could have an agreement. Okay, so we are in a situation of political despair, but nevertheless, I and others on the ground, like you are doing in your own way here in Omaha on the ground, embarked on a project of arranging interreligious dialogues between Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. So I want to first clarify my vocabulary. The conflict in our region is between two national identities. One national identity is the Jewish nation state, the state of Israel, which arose out of a movement known as Zionism, which was the Jewish national liberation movement of the Jewish people, which founded a state. The second movement, side by side and even inside Israel, is the Palestinian national movement, which now officially seeks to create a state side by side with Israel. These two peoples are trying to figure out how to share the land. So the essence of our conflict is a national conflict based on land. In addition to that, we'll talk about it in a minute, there are religious overtones to this conflict, which have become more prominent in recent years. So when we bring people together in dialogue, we bring Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. Okay? And the first thing we do is to get to know a lot about each other's personal identities, or they call it now in the literature, personal narratives, your own stories. We go on weekends together, we meet each other's homes, we meet for coffee, we do all kinds of informal icebreakers. We do not begin our dialogue process with politics or the history of the conflict. Those groups who do that or used to do that usually are finished by the end of the day, if they make it through a whole day. Okay? We do not start with what divides us. We try to begin with what unites us. Now, I would argue that this is a good thing to do anywhere. But in our neighborhood, we have a particular problem of very deeply ingrained stereotypes about the other. Right? So if you invite Jews to meet Palestinians, Jewish Israelis to meet Palestinians, in most cases for the first time in their lives, and we're talking about youth, young adults, religious leaders, educators, okay? Mostly who haven't met the other. You're inviting Jews to meet Palestinians for the first time in their life. What's in their mind? What are they thinking? What are they nervous about? Anybody?
Question? Is that a rhetorical question?
Yes, that's a rhetorical question, but you can answer it if you want. If you can throw out an answer.
That the others are out to get you and they're going to steal your land? And
Right. They're worried. The Jews are worried that the Palestinians are the enemy, who are out to get you, who are, quote, terrorists, and so forth. And the Palestinians see the Jews in similar ways. They think the Jews are out to steal your land. They're called in their communities oppressors, occupiers, settlers, various bad names. Okay? So that each side sees each other in very negative ways. So it's very different than in Switzerland or somewhere, Northern California, in a more peaceful part of the world, where all you have is mutual ignorance. Here we have mutual hatred and animosity, some of which is based on real stuff, but a lot of it is based on kind of the way the narrative has been told in a particular community. So the first thing we do is personal dialogue, get to know the other as a human being. And we have discovered that when you do that, and when you do it well with trained facilitators who teach people how to listen to one another compassionately, we have discovered, or we have seen people discover, a very radical discovery, which is that the other side is a human being. And I would add, I had no knowledge of that before from all my other information. I sometimes call it de-demonizing the other. Because the other is the devil, the demon who's out to kill me, and now I've discovered he or she is a human being. That's a big discovery. That's very important. Second thing we began to do in our work as an interreligious organization, we thought we were facing a real problem in our societies that religious identities, particularly two, were making things much worse. So I have good news if there are any Christians in the room. The Christians are off the hook this time. And the good news is the war between Christians and Jews ended about 50, 60 years ago. So we're not killing each other, and we don't even hate each other anymore. So how's that? That's some progress. Okay, so the real struggle is between, quote, certain perceptions of Islam and certain perceptions of Judaism that seem to be out to kill each other. Radical Islam, and if you want radical Judaism, are the ones that dominate the headlines, and therefore people think all Muslims think that way, or all Jews think that way. And there seems to be a very violent clash, particularly in the West Bank, it used to be in Gaza, between radical Islam and radical Judaism. So we wanted to do something to overcome that, and particularly the misinformation and disinformation and perception that all Muslims think that way and all Jews think that way. So we did something very simple, which you could do here in Omaha, no problem. We brought teachers, rabbis and imams and priests to open the books, the sacred texts that we have, the Quran, the Hadith, the Bible, the Talmud, the Midrash, the Old Testaments, the Church Father, all those kinds of texts, and we opened the books and learned with one each other with good teachers. And we discovered that even doing a little bit of that changed a lot of the misperceptions and misinformation and disinformation that people get from the internet, from Facebook, and from their newspapers and from their television, which seem to be teaching them all these other ideas. That led us to what I call radical discovery number 2, which was, first we learned that the other person is human. Now we learned that the other person's religion is not as bad as we thought. In fact, we seem to share some very basic values about humanistic culture, about love, about justice, about ethics. Did you know that there are things about ethics in the Quran? A lot of people didn't know it. I was teaching a course in Drew a couple weeks ago. We had someone teaching a Muslim text, and one Christian woman said to me, "That's the first time I heard that. I had no idea." Okay, so bringing people to learn each other's texts with teachers who could interpret taught us that we had a lot in common, which was a major important discovery if we want to move forward. And so we have personal trust, we have what I call interreligious trust, and now we can move forward to step 3, which is discussing the core issues of the conflict and relating to the double narrative. I must tell you that when the first time we did this, we had a psychologist who was working with us, who was our chief facilitator. And when he said we were going to do this, I said, "Uh-oh, I think this is not a good idea, because we'll quickly get into politics and everybody will be yelling and shouting at each other." And he said, "No, trust me. We've created an ambience of dialogue, which means a lot of careful listening. Let's see what happens." And I have to say, I learned from him he was right, and I was a little too nervous. So, what did we do? We didn't just talk about political issues. We said to the people in the dialogue group, "You can now, because we have a relationship, we trust each other, you can bring up any issue that you want that's bothering you. You heard something in the news yesterday, something in your community, a terrorist incident, a counter-terrorist incident, whatever's on your mind, you can bring it to the group, but there's one condition. You can't say they, and you can't say my prime minister said or your prime minister said. That's not the discussion. You have to say, I think, I feel." Okay? So you have to personalize the narrative, what you are thinking and feeling about a particular issue. And often we would get behind the news and find out a lot of things we heard on the radio at breakfast were wrong or inaccurate. Okay? And out of this came 2 major learnings. The first has to do with what we call the double narrative in our region, which is, I now know, if I've been in a good dialogue group, that there is a thing out there called the Palestinian narrative, and there is one called the Jewish Zionist narrative. I am sensitive to these narratives. I don't agree 100% with either one. I may have disagreements. I may be slightly to the right or slightly to the left. I may be in the center. But I can no longer say that there is no such thing as the narrative of the other side, because I've heard it, and I know that it exists to some degree. One of the best examples, if you don't know this, is how each side relates to the 1948 war, right? On the Jewish-Israeli side, it's called the War of Independence, or in Hebrew, Milchemet HaShichur, which means the War of Liberation. Okay, a very heavy word. And on the Palestinian side, it's called the Nakba. Here we have some advanced students. Okay, the Nakba is Arabic for the Great Catastrophe, the day when hundreds of villages were lost and the refugee crisis began and so on. So one date and two sides see the same thing oppositely. Both narratives, by the way, have their own amount of pain and suffering. They're not all joyful. And it's not easy to hear the other person's narrative. But if you've been in a genuine dialogue group, you've now listened to the narrative of the other. The other thing we learned is that even though there's this so-called meta-narrative, mainstream narrative of each, beneath that, there are multiple narratives. So those of you who know something about Israeli life, we have multiple political parties representing many different narratives on the center, right, and left. And the Palestinian side has many different political parties. They have Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, and many sub-parties. In other words, even though there's this meta-narrative, there are multiple narratives, and each person tells their own story based on where they live and where they grow up and what village and town they live in, and it really varies from person to person. So it sensitized us to the fact that even though this meta-narrative is there, there are also many personal narratives that are beneath the surface. Okay, and the last thing that was important to us in our dialogue work was the idea that dialogue should lead to action. I must confess to you, this was not accepted by everybody. Particularly some of the facilitators, the educators say, I'm an educator, I know about education. If you want action, go next door to another organization which is an activist organization. And I don't combine both in who I am. I and others did not accept that idea, and we said dialogue should lead to action. What's action? Action could mean anything from posting something on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, to all the way up to political action, to educational action, to communal action. There's a wide range of things people could do, and in almost all the dialogue groups we ran, they ended with somebody doing some kind of personal or group project together. So I set that forth as a principle which may be useful to you here in Omaha. And in America, there are many people who feel that talk is easy, but action is harder. And can we somehow combine the two? And I think, I know that there are many efforts in this country trying to do that as well. Okay. My final few words before I open it up to some questions and discussion. So the first part of what I talked about in the peacemaking world, the political diplomatic thing, is known in the literature these days as peacemaking. Peacemaking refers to the work of lawyers, diplomats, international relations experts, whose job is to create peace treaties, peace accords between governments. And as I said, we had quite a few of them in the 90s. The last one was 98, okay? One of my friends calls those pieces of paper. P-I-E-C-E, okay? So you can create a piece of paper and then everybody ignores it, so it has sometimes limited usefulness. The other side of the work is referred to in the literature these days as peace building. Peace building, different from peacemaking, is not the work of the lawyers and the diplomats and the international relations people. It's the work of what we call in our civic society, NGOs, rabbis, imams, priests, educators, social workers, youth workers, kind of almost everybody else, okay? And peace building is the work of creating opportunities and for the future, for our children and grandchildren to learn to live in peace with each other, even if it can't be happening in a full sense right now. So I'll finish with this. I believe that we need another peace agreement. The sooner the better. I don't know if you, this morning I saw on TV that the current administration is working on a Middle East peace agreement. I see a few people rolling their eyebrows who are not total believers. But it's on the news. I just report what I heard on the news. We need another peace agreement. I don't care how it happens. We need one. Okay? It'll be better than not having one. But the real challenge for the future is not another piece of paper. The real challenge I suggest to you is creating the conditions where we can learn to live in peace with our neighbors for the long term. And that will require lots and lots of peace building work in education, in media, in social change. And it's not only the work of the politicians. The politicians have to do their part, and we have to do our part, and we have to work together on that in our part of the world as well. I'm open to your questions. And I had a piece of paper, so I like to take a few at a time. I'll take this.
I'll just share with you, you do have paper and pens on your table. If you would like to write down your question rather than to voice it, I'd be happy to have you bring that forward, or I'll come around and try to collect them from the tables. So I'll give you a moment to be able to do that if you wish. There's paper and pens that are in each of the tables if you'd like to write down rather than recognize. I would ask you to frame your comments as a question, not as comments, just to pose a question, a short question if you would, so that we have opportunity for a number of different people to be able to contribute.
Could we ask the question just audibly instead of?
You can, yes, you can, yeah, that would be fine.
Take two, we'll take three at a time.
Sure, we're going to try to take a few different questions at a time so that he can help to cluster them, so we'll see a pattern perhaps in the questions in terms of the response. And while you're taking an opportunity to write on the tables or get a refreshment, I did want to extend a word of appreciation and thanksgiving to Wendy Goldberg, our new Associate Director, for helping to set up and make the arrangements today. Dennis DePort, who runs everything at the temple, serves as a director here and helping to make arrangements for our lunch. For Ray Mines, who's come to join us, is helping us with our filming. As part of our new effort to have media production and doing videography. And I wanted to encourage you to make certain that you have on your calendars for January 29th, because we're going to be showing a film at Film Streams at the Ruth Sokoloff Theater in the evening. It's a 7 o'clock showing. It's actually related to this topic area. It's a film called The Judge. It's about the first female Sharia law court judge in Israel, servicing the Palestinian people, and it's actually been something that's been received well in independent theaters here in the United States. Has been on PBS, but we're going to have an opportunity, we hope, to have the director. We're trying to arrange for her to come here and join us. So that's January the 29th at 7 p.m. at the Ruth Sokoloff Theater. It's part of a community partnership between Tri-Faith and Film Streams. So that's 7 p.m. January the 29th. I also want to remind you that we do have his lovely book, The Other Peace Process, that's available, and he'll be doing signings shortly after your questions here out in the lobby, and we're very thankful to have the folks from Urban Abbey here with us to sell the books as well as a few other items. So please, a few of your questions, and Ron will entertain them. I'll come around and collect.
Okay. 1, 2, was there a third? 1, 2, 3, is that a question? Okay. Yes? Okay. So 1, 2, and 3. Tell us your name.
My name is Elaine Wells, and I'm really thrilled to hear about your dialogue process because I've been organizing, facilitating dialogue dialogue since 1993.
Oh, wow.
First in pro-life, pro-choice, then black-white dialogues, most recently conservative and liberal dialogues.
Wow.
So I would love to do something like that between the Palestinian community here in Omaha and the Jewish community.
Wow.
I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about how we could start to involve people
Yeah.
and interested in that process.
Okay. Yes, I do, but go ahead, please.
I'm John Waldbaum, a member of the Temple. Does what we're doing here make a difference outside of Omaha?
Okay. And no, there was a third person.
Yes, I'm Linda Hines from Countryside, and I've been following and supporting Jewish Voices for Peace. And I'm wondering how effective that group is in peace building, or is there some other group that you see as very effective with that same kind of orientation, Jewish Voices for Peace?
Okay. And you what? Go ahead.
Yes.
I can't read the name. What's your name?
Yes, my name is Sandy Hanna. I'm from Presbyterian Church of the Master. I'm wondering why you didn't list the nonviolent First Intifada on your.
Oh, because I didn't go back that far. I started in the 90s. That's why. But I can, I'll tell you why. Okay. All right. So, yes?
And I have 4 in written form.
4 in written form. Okay, we'll deal with these first 4. Okay. Elaine, involving people. So here's what we did, and I think this might be helpful because to create a successful dialogue group, in our experiences, you need to weed out the monologuers. The monologuers can go, somewhere else. They can go to the university, I don't know, run a church or a synagogue. No, whatever. The dialoguers. So we did it in 2 ways. We built a process. We designed, let's say, I didn't mention this. Most of our dialogues were long-term projects, a year, sometimes 2 or 3. The longest went 5. It's not a Sunday morning activity for 3 hours. It's a process, what I try to describe to the first part, step 1, would often take months, 3 months. So, but prior to it, we did recruiting, and then we did some selection work. So once we had the process outlined, we would invite, let's say if we had a women's group or you target a group. We had youth group or young adults or religious leaders. We'd invite people in. We didn't just put up a sign. Anybody who wants to come dialogue Sunday morning, drop in. And then we'd interview them. And we'd tell them, okay, there's a thing, by the way, I don't know if you know about this. If anybody wants to convert to Judaism, the rabbi's supposed to warn them and tell them this is a risky religion to be part of. You sure you want to do this? And you were supposed to get warned like 3 times. And so we warn them that dialogue is a risky business. You have to be open. You have to be able to deal with some emotional issues. Not all dialogue is a bunch of rational people thinking rational all the time. So we warn them a lot, and so people might self-select out. This isn't for me. And then very often, particularly with youth, we would do kind of workshops where we'd put them through a mini dialogue, and then the people who couldn't handle it would either drop out or we'd help them drop out. So that meant by the time you got to the meeting, you had, let's say, 16 people who really wanted to be there and were somewhat prepared. Okay? The other trick, I mean, you've been facilitating for a long time, is really to do careful facilitation. Okay? Don't leave it wide open and to do whatever they want. It needs good facilitation, especially when it gets emotional. We developed a method which worked quite well, which was to have a Palestinian and Jewish Israeli co-facilitating with a translator who knew both languages. That's kind of complicated, but it helped earn trust. Okay? So I think the orientation and getting people to the room, knowing pretty well what they're going to be there for, and knowing that they have to be open and ready to hear sometimes some painful things and some information that you, by your whole life story, don't agree with, is part of the process. And it's not just a simple process. Okay, John, Do you make a difference outside? I don't know yet. I hope so. I would like to. I think so. I don't know how many people know about this. I didn't tell Bud yet, but I write a blog, and I'm going to probably write something about this because I think it's an amazing initiative. So I don't know how many people know. I think people should know. I think people in Israel should know. I'll tell you a funny story. I gave a talk in Philadelphia on Sunday morning, and a woman came up to me afterwards, and she said, I have a crazy idea, Jewish one. What if we built a center in Jerusalem for Jews and Christians and Muslims to come and dialogue and have cultural things and show films together and do all this? She said, this is really a way out idea. I said, that's a great idea. Why don't you make it happen? So these ideas, you're not the only person to have the idea, the only group to have the ideas. I think they're happening in other places. So I think more people should know about what you're doing here, not just in America, but in Israel. I think the idea that the children of Abraham can live together is a good idea for other people to know about, because it's not the mainstream notion, certainly not where I live. Okay. Linda, about Jewish Voices for Peace, I don't know too much about the organization. I know it's here in America. We don't have it in Israel, so I can't comment. It's part of the landscape of different Jewish voices. There's J Street and Jewish Voices, and if not know when, who are trying to be active in this country, lobbying for peace processes in the Middle East from here. But I don't know enough about it to really say. And Sandy, why I didn't mention the first Intifada, which was in 1987.
Right, and the occupation, you have two unequal groups here, an occupier and a
Yes.
occupied.
So this wasn't meant to be a full history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it was meant to be a survey just to make certain points that were germane to my subject. But since you brought it up, I don't mind relating to it. Part of the problem with both narratives, as I see it, is my personal view, the Palestinian narrative and the Jewish-Israeli narrative, is what I call the emphasis on victimization. So, from 1993 to 1995, when I thought peace was at hand, I ran a series of seminars. We called it Educating About Each Other in the Era of Peace. And then in 1995, after Rabin was assassinated, we changed the name and we called it Educating About Each Other in the beginning of the Era of Peace. We realized we weren't quite there yet. And we ran a seminar for 2 days on the 1948 war. And the last session was called Looking Towards the Future. And I wound up chairing that session because the chairperson who was supposed to be there couldn't be there. And the question I posed was, do you think that in the future, this is 1995, the future is now, we could have a situation where historians would come from the West and speak to Palestinians, speak to Israelis, and write a book called The New Synthetic History of Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, bringing the narratives of both sides. By the way, such books have already been written. And there was a Palestinian professor who had come from a university in Nablus that day, and he said to us, that's a great idea. I really like that idea. But in the meantime, we, on our side, will continue to tell our story, our narrative, which is the narrative of suffering, how much we side. And on the Jewish side, you will continue to tell your narrative of suffering, how much you suffered since the Holocaust to this very day. I don't know if you know, there's a group in Israel called the Victims of Arab Terror, and they're out there every day telling about all they suffered. And we have this competing narrative of suffering, which, in my view, doesn't get us very far in the end. So, yes, we have an asymmetric situation between occupation and occupier. We have an asymmetric situation between what we call, or the Israelis call terror, and the Palestinians call our Air Force state terror. So there's a lot of imbalances. But I guess I try not to focus on that too much in my talk, because I want to look towards the future and not so much towards the past. So yeah, I say we've had a lot of violence and counter-violence, and we now have to move to another. All right, I'm ready for 4 more. Give me some cards. Are you synthesizing, or am I?
I'm just going to share them with you. I can bring them to you.
Okay. All right.
So these represent diverse narratives and points of view.
Okay.
Questions. What are peace-building actions currently happening that are producing positive notes for the future? Can you discuss what makes them work? So some positive notes for the future. What are the successful models?
Right.
Can you discuss the conflict between quote-unquote peacemakers, peace builders?
Okay.
Who is benefiting from the conflict, specifically economically?
Okay.
This has one sentence of statement prior to the question, but it says, to reduce this conflict to identity politics is ignoring the Palestinian struggle against a Zionist settler project. Explain how Israel is seeking peace as they continue to militarily occupy Palestinian land for over 50 years. Question is,
Okay. We'll stop with that for now? Okay. All right. Peace-building actions that work. Okay. So in my organization, we spend a lot of our time and money on working with youth and young adults, people in their teens, 20s, and early 30s. At one point, we had over 300 young people who had graduated. We invited them back for other activities. And I always felt that working with youth and young adults was the way to go, because they are less burnt out and less cynical, because they haven't lived through all the things that older people have lived through. And now I'm on as an advisor on for a group called Kids for Peace. Anybody heard of Kids for Peace? Okay, so here a good one. Kids for Peace is a interfaith youth organization in Jerusalem with headquarters, I think, in Washington, D.C., run by Reverend Josh Thomas, who I think lives in Texas, but I think their office is in Washington. And this started out of St. George's Episcopal Church in Jerusalem, and it became its own NGO. And they work with elementary school kids, now high school kids, now college kids. And one of the things they do is they do dialogue work in Jerusalem, and they bring them to America, to Texas, North Carolina, San Diego, I forget everywhere they go, to meet Israeli Jews and Palestinians living in America. And so they've made this dialogue broader, and it's a fabulous organization. And they're doing great work despite all the difficulties on the ground. So I commend you to know about Kids for Peace. There's another one called Hands for Peace. It's based in Chicago. It started with a interfaith group of Christians and Jews, and probably Muslims too, in Chicago. They're doing wonderful work, similar things they do work on the ground there, and they bring people to America. There's, of course, Seeds for Peace, the famous one with the camp in Maine. And there are others who are like that, who are doing work similar to the model I described to you, particularly in moving from dialogue to action as people have been through the process. And these groups do this with lack of great funding and lack of great support from their countries, and there are others. So there used to be, I don't know if it exists anymore, there was a group I belonged to for several years. It was called Peace NGOs. You can look it up if it's still there. It had something like 50 peace NGOs on the Israeli side and 50 on the Palestinian side. And we used to meet periodically, and it got funding from the Italian government and the European government. I think it was in some sort of crisis a couple years ago, and I lost track whether it's still around. So I only mention that because there are lots of groups that you don't hear about. They don't make our front page story, and they often don't make the back page story. I actually, if you want to look at my blog on the Times of Israel, I started a series a few months ago, and I may put this into a book. And I wanted to write about, I call it Peace Builders in Israel and Palestine. or my subtitle is People Who Haven't Given Up, ... yet. Strike that. Okay, so I think I've written in 6 or 8 of them already about people on the ground, either individuals or organizations who are doing work for peace. Some are Palestinians, some are Jews, some are Jewish and Palestinian groups working together. And, you know, so you can check that out and read some of that. So there are groups still working for peace in Israel and Palestine who haven't given up. And some of the most impressive ones are groups like Combatants for Peace, Bereaved Family Forum, and some others which are doing cross-border work and dealing with very emotional stuff. But it's, to be very frank with you, it's underfunded and not yet mainstreamed. And so you can help make it more mainstreamed if you can all write about them on your Facebook pages and make their work more well-known in this country. Okay. The conflict between the peacemakers and the peace builders. Okay, I don't think there's necessarily a conflict. There's a different way of thinking. The peacemakers are politicos. You know some politicos? They spend their life thinking politics every minute, and they think that politics solves everything. Okay, you live in America, you may have figured it out by now. Politics doesn't solve everything. This is why you have synagogues, churches, and mosques, and what do you have in 40 NGOs in your building and thousands of NGOs, because politics, if it works well, it creates opportunities, frameworks, but it doesn't solve everything. So there's what I was trying to suggest in my talk is, there's this so-called, I call it a false dichotomy. If we only get another peace agreement, Jared's ultimate deal, then everything will be hunky-dory. Okay, well, we know that that's not correct. Maybe we'll have a new framework to do all kinds of things. But if we don't change our education system and create more economic opportunity for everybody in the long run, we'll go backwards. Okay? So there doesn't have to be a conflict. But unfortunately, these two people tend to work in two trains going down the road, and they meet occasionally. What I was trying to say, they met in 1993 at Oslo. Okay, and a lot of the people who created Oslo were peace builders. And then Ron Pundak and this one and that one, after they were in government, they founded the Paris Center for Peace. That's another one. Okay, to do NGO work, because they knew government work isn't the whole story. Okay, so what I'm trying to suggest at the end is, when we have the next peace agreement, the peace builders need to be at the table. Because there should be an education appendix and an economic appendix, which is going to relate to how we're going to live together, not just to make pieces of paper together. Okay, who benefits? Well, you know who benefits. What we used to call, when I was a student here, the military-industrial complex benefits. Right? You know benefits. People, the rejectionists, as they're called, who like war and conflict, they benefit. The people who have been successfully keeping the peace process from moving forward, whether it's rejectionists in Hamas or those groups, or rejectionists in the settler camp on the Jewish side. There are rejectionists on both sides who benefit from the status quo economically and politically and in every other way. The last question was a little complicated. It was more of a comment. The best I can say to that comment is as follows. I'll tell you a little story. I like it. Rabbi, I have to tell a story. In, let me think now. 2002, so the second Intifada, as it's called, Intifada means outbreak, uprising or casting off the occupation, broke out in 2000. The first one was in 1987, was slingshots again, David versus Goliath, and this time we were David, and no, we were Goliath, sorry. The second one in 2000 to 2003 or 4 or 5 was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and it was the Intifada characterized by suicide bombing in the name of some people's idea of God. And it was a very extremely violent round of violence, and the counter-violence was very severe. And that went on for at least 3 years, maybe 4 or 5, depending who you are. On March 7th, 2002, no, let's go back a step. In January 2002, I was invited with a Palestinian bishop, Bishop Yaniv Yunan, who's a close friend of mine. I worked with for many years in dialogue, and a Muslim Israeli guy, and we went. We were invited by Temple Emmanuel in New York for a clergy institute, and then we went to 7 or 9 different cities. And in every time my friend Bishop Yunan made his opening remarks, the three of us would get tuned in his opening remarks, and then there'd be questions and answers. He would say something like, the root of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is the occupation. And almost every time in the questions I would get asked, what did I think of that statement? And I would say, there are 2 roots to the conflict. That's one of them. And the other root is the refusal of the Palestinian side to recognize a right to live in peace and security. So that went on for 9 days, and we got back to Israel, and a few weeks later, or a month or 2 later, there was a delegation of rabbis in town, and I invited them to our center. We had 40 rabbis, and the same 3 of us who had been 9 days together in America on the road were there. And we had a presentation, and one of the rabbis asked my friend Bishop Yunan, he said to him, what do you think is the root of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And he said, there are 2 roots to the conflict. Okay? So that's what I think. I think both sides have made terrible mistakes along the other. Both sides are at fault. I can't place blame only on one side and not the other. And there's a long history of misunderstanding and lack of cooperation, and we need to focus more on the future than on the history. Okay, a few more, please.
We have to tighten this up, but we do have 3 final questions.
Okay.
How does InterReligious Dialogue facilitators, how do InterReligious Dialogue facilitators avoid discussing reparations and keep the focus on reconciliation first? So that's about reparations and reconciliation. The second question is, are Palestinian Christians involved in the dialogue that you do? How do Palestinian Christians factor in, if at all? We'll talk a little bit about the presence of Palestinian Christians. And the third question is, in under 2 minutes, can you state, going way, way back, what the core or beginning conflict or separation was between Jews and Muslims? What do you see as an origin point for this conflict, going way, way back?
Okay. Okay, so the role of good facilitators, in my view, is to facilitate honest and genuine dialogue, which is based on allowing people to listen to one another and give everybody a chance to share their ideas, their feelings, their story in an atmosphere of mutual respect and quiet discussion. So in our dialogues, we do not allow yelling. Yelling is out. It just doesn't happen. We don't allow, you are wrong. Okay? That's not part of our discussion. Maybe in some other classes you can get right or wrong. So facilitate it. So we don't tell the dialoguers whether to talk about reparations or reconciliation. We don't have the agenda set in the same way as if you were running a classroom. So someone brought up reparations, and we talk about what they have in mind and what they mean by it. If they thought about reconciliation, well, what do you mean by reconciliation? Where do you start it? You want to start in your community, your home, before you go national? You know, start in Omaha before you go national, okay, et cetera. So Good facilitation will allow people to discuss almost any issue with the idea that every person has the right to share their views and thoughts and feelings about the issue. Okay, Palestinian Christians. Yes, of course we involve Palestinian Christians. I write about this quite a bit in my book. When I started my dialogue work in early 90s, 1991, we grew up alongside the peace process. Most of the people involved, certainly on the Christian side and somewhat on the Jewish side, were what they call in my country expats. People from Germany, America, Australia, who were living there for 1 or 10 or 20 years. But almost none of them were locals who had been born there or lived there a long time. So we made a very big effort to localize the dialogue and involve Palestinian Christians, not just Christians from Germany and America and everywhere else, but Palestinian Christians. And I have to say, I have a lot of good Palestinian Christian friends who I'm in dialogue, Bishop Yunan and Father Hussam and many others. And we developed a localized dialogue with it, in which issues of liberation and dealing with the occupation comes up in our conversations. Okay? And we will read the Bible together and study together and talk together about common issues, and we've done this for many years. So Palestinian Christians are in what we call a double minority. They're a minority in the Muslim world, they're a minority in the Jewish state, so they got a lot of their own issues. They are a small minority in the West Bank, a smaller in Gaza, small minority in the state of Israel as well, mostly in the Galilee. But we bring them into the dialogue, often, by the way, in a kind of bridge building way. They often see themselves as bridge builders. Because, as I said earlier, they're not in this war that deeply, certainly not as Christians anymore. Okay, Jews and Muslims way back. Okay, well, so I was just writing something about this yesterday, so I'm glad you asked the question because it's on my mind a little. So, you know, for those of you who are not Jewish, the Jews read every week a portion from the Torah. From the 5 books of Moses, we read a selection, and we go through the whole book, the whole 5 books every year, okay? So we're now at the end of the book of Genesis, and a few weeks ago, in Parshat Vayera, we read about the story of Ishmael and Hagar, and then the next chapter, chapter 22, we read about Isaac. Both children of Abraham, speaking of Abraham, okay? And for those of you who don't know, on our Jewish New Year's, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I don't know if it's still well, in Reform Judaism it might be slightly different, but in Conservative and Orthodox Judaism, we read Genesis 21, the story of Ishmael and Hagar on first day Rosh Hashanah, and the story of Isaac, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac on second day Rosh Hashanah. So now Jews around the world have read this twice in the last couple of months. Okay. Now, which means that Jews in their synagogues all over the world know also the story of Ishmael and Hagar, which is part of the Bible and part of the Jewish tradition. But Ishmael falls off, and Ishmael becomes the Muslim people, as Edom becomes Rome, becomes the Christians. And later on in Genesis, we have Isaac and Ishmael meet each other where? Abraham's funeral, right? So the commentators say, oh, if they met at Abraham's funeral, this is one of the great reconciliations. Very quietly done in the Torah, but obviously they were able to come together at that moment. So our story goes back a long time. Jews to Ishmael and Isaac, and I think it's time for the cousins or brothers to be brotherly again, one with one another. So yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for all your questions. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor.
Thank you all for coming.